And I'd love to welcome onto the stage. So this session is the present regulatory landscape and how to shape its future. So folks, this is really going to be the nuts and bolts of what is going to be legally possible and how this industry will be regulated now and in the years to come. So first up, I'd love to welcome Ismail Ali, who's the Director of Policy and Advocacy for MAPS. We have Hadas Alterman, who's a partner at the Plant Medicine Law Group. We have Jeff Mendelson, who is a founder and an entrepreneur and an investor, and he has been at the forefront of some of the biggest movements around regulating industry for ethics, such as the B-Labs movement. And we have, last but not least, Nicole Howell. Nicole is a partner at Clark Howell Law Firm. And I also would like to mention that Nicole, Ismail, and Hadas are founding board members of the Psychedelic Bar Association, and that Jeff and Nicole serve on the North Star board. And I am going to take a seat next to Nicole and offer moderation for this panel. But to kick us off, I'm going to invite Izzy, Ismail, and Hadas up here. And they're going to start with a briefing on policy and access pathways. Thank you.
Good day, everyone. Happy Thursday. Okay, let me get situated. Good morning. Can everyone hear me okay? Thanks for being here. I'm excited to be here. I've been having the opportunity to come out to Horizon since I think 2016. And it's really amazing to see the way that the community has flourished and expanded and evolved in all the ways that were talked about in the last session. I'm especially excited to co-present this particular session with Hadas. Hadas and I sat next to each other on the first day of law school many years ago, and we've kind of been in and out of this weaving journey for quite some time. I think that if you asked our law school colleagues what we were best known for, it would probably be our parties. But alas, here we are to talk about the legal pathways to psychedelics and policy reform. So what we're going to do today is give a little bit of a roadmap. I'm going to talk a little bit about medicalization, just to kind of give a sense of what I think people are probably most familiar with already, given all of the pharma therapeutic pathways that kind of Jamie touched on in his last session. And then Hadas will talk a bit about decriminalization and legalization, two pathways that are building tremendous momentum, but that have a less clear of a dynamic as far as what is going to happen with them next and where we go. We're both going to be saying a lot, and we have a lot of opinions, so please bear with us. This is going to be a short and quick presentation, but there will be time for Q&A, and I certainly love going deeper into any of these topics. So first off, how the heck do we get at a psychedelic and business forum? Wow, we're here. I want to just touch before doing anything on the war on drugs, something that we, I think, have different levels of familiarity with, and recognizing that there is, in fact, an ongoing system of oppression that continues to exist for a lot of people across the country and across the world. The reason I say that is because it's really easy to get excited, and those of us that were around while cannabis was expanding need to remember that there are actually people who are still really, really dramatically affected by their utilization of these substances for a lot of different reasons, not just people who've been incarcerated, but also indigenous people who've been protecting this work for a very, very, very long time and who remain doing so, not just the substances, but the land itself. And I say that because I don't want us to forget it, because it's really easy to talk about it and not be about it. And there's about to be a lot of money in the field, and I think it's really important that some of it goes back. So, given the early stage of this paradigm and where we're at, I also want to touch on one more thing before I go toward medicalization, which is this concept of spiritual use and therapeutic, or sacramental use, as Jamie touched on earlier in his presentation, which I really appreciated. Sirens for spiritual use. Spiritual practice with psychedelic substances by indigenous or mestizo or hybrid cultures is hella old. It's old. It's older than anything we're going to talk about today. And although we're not going to be focused on it so much in our presentation, don't get it twisted. Spirit runs through everything here. And I want that to be really clear because we're not going to go into it so much when it comes to like legal business policy pathways, but it's a really critical piece and something that I think needs to be in the back and probably in the front of our mind throughout this conversation because that's also happening in parallel track. If you're interested in that particular topic, Allison Hoots authored with Chacruna this amazing RFRA guide. It's like 78 pages long. Chacruna just released it on the 15th of December. They'll be doing a forum about it. Check it out. It's a really deep dive into spiritual use, RFRA, all of these kind of different pieces. Highly recommended. It's something like really worth looking at. If there's one takeaway from this religion conversation that we go into, it's that your retreat center is not a religion. If there's one takeaway, your retreat center is not a religion. And I think that's really critical to mention because while there is a lot of value from retreat centers that have spiritual elements, no doubt, I just want to make sure that that's crystal clear to the people here, both because legally speaking, it's just a risky business to try to get into it, but also specifically because for those that are actually practicing their sacramental work and not just like making things up so they can give people psychedelics, there actually is a legitimate spiritual tradition that is needed to be preserved and is needed to be protected. And I think that it's easy, again, to like get run away into the retreat center world. And I love retreat centers. They have their time and place, but I just want to make sure that the distinction is abundantly clear because a lot of people seem to think you can just use categories to define and explain things and structure things without actually thinking about the origin of those concepts. So what I'm going to do briefly, now that I've touched on those, I think, very key points, is just touch on this topic of medicalization. In the schema that was presented earlier, pharma and therapy were kind of broken out. I would actually kind of put those in the same category, only because I think the way, while there will likely be, and I think that we're in the world of emerging purely pharmaceutical, purely like psychophysical interventions, the evidence seems to show, and I would be very surprised by if we're just going to get spontaneous healing without any other human intervention. And I think that's really critical to mention because the community aspect, the relational aspect, the healing aspect of a lot of these substances, when we do reduce them to medical interventions or when we do reduce them to healing modalities, is still often mostly coming out of a relational or a self-initiated process. The psychedelics, the substances are really keys. They're kind of catalysts to these processes that already exist inside of us and are already possible through interaction with people, but are not necessarily part of the same, that are not necessarily occurring purely because of that chemical interaction. So when talking about the origin of clinical trials and medicalization and the purpose of getting into the FDA framework, I want to go back to this conversation about drug policy because one of the main benefits of taking something through FDA is the fact that it actually starts shifting the scheduling system. And by placing a drug in Schedule I, this government has decided there's no medical value. By having some sort of determination, medically speaking, from FDA or another federal agency that there is medical value, we suddenly start breaking apart this framework and maybe show for the first time very clearly that the original categorization of these substances was false, misleading, and inaccurate. The other core thing I want to touch on, which was also mentioned earlier around the implications of entering healthcare, is this core understanding of an insurance-based payment for care model. That's really critical because when we think about health, we think about the way that we actually deliver health. Only through the mechanism of delivery can we actually understand how to spread and how to scale that healthcare. In the United States, when we're dealing with a private insurance primarily model, when we're dealing with these kind of insurance frameworks, the way that the healthcare industry and the psychedelics industry is entering healthcare is in direct response to that insurance-based system. I think if and when we have some sort of universal-based healthcare system, prayers up for that, it is very possible that the way we think about healthcare delivery will be different. The last thing I'll say about medicalization before passing on to my colleague Hadas is this. You can have the most amazing intervention, the most effective, the most critical next level intervention that you've ever seen, ever heard of. Some psychedelics seem to be that way. But if you're not thinking about the way that they're delivered, even the best intervention will increase health disparity. This is a really important point. Only by intentionally looking at the delivery models can we actually reverse health disparities. So for all the language you're talking about, that we're talking about delivery, about healthcare, about all these possible medical benefits, it's by looking at delivery and actually reducing or eliminating disparities that will actually have the impact that we claim to want to have so bad. So thank you for that. I'm going to pass it to Hadas to talk about the other fun topics. Really appreciate it.
Hi, good morning. Can y'all hear me? Okay. So I want to talk about decriminalization, what it means, what it does not mean. You will probably hear me abbreviate decriminalization into decrim because we're low on time, and those 5 extra syllables actually really add up. All right, so typically when we're talking about drug decriminalization, what we mean is a reduction or elimination of criminal penalties, typically for personal use and possession. So that's what decriminalization is in this context. What it is not is decriminalization of supply. Decriminalization does not equate to legalization. Legalization is when, and we'll talk about this more in a minute, you have the supply and the demand side, and both become permissible and regulated by the government. One of the things we don't have much time to go into, but I want to name, is that by not regulating supply, although there's value to decriminalizing personal possession and use, we continue to perpetuate a lot of the harm and a lot of the risk that is being done by the war on drugs. But decriminalization is a really important first step. And it's not the entire paradigm shift, but I think it's a part of it. And the way that I see that shift and the way we're seeing it manifest in real time is a move away from punitive measures, punitive treatment of people who use drugs, and a shift towards this idea of something more humane, something more compassionate, and something that's more attendant to the realities of public health. If the concern is health and safety, then the solutions should be health and safety focused, not punishment. So one of the policies that we've recently seen, and it's actually the first of its kind in the United States that I want to talk about that illustrates this shift, is Measure 110 in Oregon. And Measure 110 reduces criminal penalties for eliminates criminal penalties for low-level drug possession. And the way that it does this is by changing multiple criminal sentencing laws that regulate possession for controlled substances, and they've changed those from felonies to Class E violations, which is a newly created category that essentially consists of an $100 fine or the option to take a health screening assessment. So there's the reduction in punitive measures, and then the screening assessment points to the public health focus. Oregon has created, as part of this measure, a network of behavioral health service centers, and they're actually about to allocate around $300 million to funding them and making sure that people are accessing quality care, culturally competent care, linguistically appropriate care. So that's an exciting thing. The next measure I want to the next bill actually that I want to talk about is Senate Bill 519, which is currently paused in Assembly in California. And this bill would decriminalize use and possession and facilitated or supported use that is not for financial gain. So again, this does not decriminalize sale. However, there is a little bit of a gray area, I think, that's being created. The definition of financial gain here excludes charging reasonable fees for services that are adjacent to controlled substances. So practically what that would mean is I could gift you psilocybin, and I could charge you a reasonable fee for facilitating your trip, and that would be within the bounds of the law. It's kind of a tricky thing because you are sort of creating a de facto unregulated market. But there's sort of the political willpower and the trust to make that happen, and we'll see what happens with that. So I want to shift quickly to legalization because I am running out of time. And really, legalization theory is the full spectrum. We're allowing the supply side, we're allowing the demand side of the market to be, it's permitted, it's heavily regulated, and the biggest, the most clear, robust example we have of that is cannabis on a state-by-state basis. And then Measure 109, which is an Oregon law that's currently being processed through the Oregon Health Authority for regulations. And it creates a psilocybin services framework where a person can go and get treatment, pay for services from a licensed facilitator at a licensed service center. And one of the things that I want to really impress upon everyone here is that this is not therapy. Psilocybin services under the Act do not create a therapeutic program. It's not medical. And the reason that that's the case is because at this point, the way insurance works, it's going to be really difficult to incentivize therapists to go and get licensed by the state of Oregon, to licensed under the psilocybin services program, because insurance is not going to cover their patients. To participate, and insurance, as it stands right now, they're not going to give them malpractice insurance. And so it's important to understand that this is sort of a space that exists between medical use and recreational, because it's also not recreational. You're not going to be able to go to a service center and buy a bag of mushrooms and go hang out in the forest, unfortunately. So it's a very interesting thing, and it doesn't neatly fit into any category. And the other point I quickly want to make is that there are going to be controls on market share, which I think is really important. A person's not going to be able to have a financial interest in more than one manufacturing facility. A person can't have a financial interest in more than 5 service centers, and there's a 2-year residency requirement. So while people are already finding tons of loopholes around this, and the law hasn't even been implemented yet, I do think it's a good attempt to try to keep the market reasonably small and allow for different businesses and different organizations to thrive. Different types of capital are going to come in. That's what happens with legalization. That's what happens with cannabis. Historically, government agencies are not necessarily the best at anticipating these types of changes and how conditions are going to shift, how behavioral incentives are going to shift under legalization, and I think that that's why what Jeff and Nicole are going to talk about is so important, because we as a community and as businesses need to be, people putting in place safeguards with teeth, because the government's not going to just do it for us.
So I'm really grateful that Jeff is here to join us today, because Jeff has already lived through what the psychedelic industry is going through right now with the green industry. And Jeff has been part of trying to grapple with what it can look like when our government and regulatory processes are not showing up to appropriately regulate companies, how industries can come together and do that for themselves. And so I'm really pleased to have Jeff Mendelson here with us today.
Thank you. Wow, well, that's my goal, is to share my lived experience doing this work over the past 30 years of being in a company, starting companies, advising companies, investing in companies, and then also participating in communities of companies that really want to drive change deeper. So I started my first company in the 90s called New Leaf Paper, and our mission was to lead a shift towards sustainability in the paper industry. So it was a big mission. And it was part of sort of the second wave of natural products companies following Stonyfield and Ben & Jerry's and Adwala. And it was a really amazing community of people, and many of them are still some of my best friends. There's one right here. We, over the years, did a lot of things that feel similar to what's happening right now. You know, there was Social Venture Network, there was BSR, it was actually kind of a cool group way back in the day in the 90s. And then, you know, B Corporation, et cetera. So with my 10 minutes, I'm going to share some of my experiences as a CEO of a pioneering business, and then focus my time on my experience with the founding of B Corporation and the really, you know, landmark success it had in driving new corporate code. All right. So first, just briefly about New Leaf. We experienced one kind of major success, I would say, at New Leaf, and that was there was a real battle for impact metrics, and a lot of the virgin paper companies were trying to claim that their papers had, you know, certain attributes, and then recycled papers had their attributes, and chlorine bleaching attributes, et cetera. And at New Leaf, we created our eco audit, and this was before certifications were out there, and we created it kind of like an Intel Inside brand story, and we're able to kind of win the war of impact metrics in the paper industry, which is kind of amazing. And our customers would actually use this as a way of sharing the impact from using the product. But we didn't do the hard work. The hard work was done by this group called the Paper Task Force, led by nonprofits with an incredible 3-year process of doing life cycle analysis. And they did this before there was any life cycle analysis regulation, and it's still probably the best done LCA I've seen, you know, 20 years, 30 years later. So I won't go through all the details, there's no time for that, but they did all this amazing work, and they came up with really good data on the benefits of using recycled paper with clean bleaching. And in 1995, they published their findings, and the US government was involved, and it just sat there. Nobody was using it. So in 98, when we started, we're like, wait a second, this is amazing data. We created our eco audit, and we got very big customers like Mr. Potter to use it, and it changed the industry. So the tail kind of wagged the dog, and our strategy was the paper industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry. They're deeply invested in not changing. They had very bad margins, big machines. Change was not easy. So we had to drive change by shaping the market and driving demand. So that's a little victory, a little tail wag there. Then when we set our sights higher, we wanted to impact regulation. And LCAs were continuing to come out that were absolutely misleading and worse. So this is a little brief history of some of the regulations. I won't go into it, there's no time, we can talk later. But in 2012, there was this amazing initiative to actually build standards that replicated what was actually done way back when on this Paper Task Force LCA. So what did I do? As a CEO, I would get up in front of audiences like this one and talk about what was wrong around what was happening around the industry with these incredibly misleading LCAs. And there's these 4 major sins, and I won't go into them right now, but they're pretty interesting if you want to geek out on it later. We also attempted to use humor. So one of the most bizarre things is they would use a 100-year time frame to measure impacts of climate metrics, and that would dramatically reduce their evaluation of their impact. When, you know, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was very clear that 100 years is a little long. And then we would extol the virtues of the right way to approach these LCAs. And then we did the first one using the new standard for our product. And it didn't take on, it didn't work. So the message here that I want to say is that New Leaf was able to drive some change in its industry, acting as a sole pioneer, relatively alone, with amazing nonprofit partners, I should say, that it would have been impossible without. But we weren't able to build sort of regulatory or legal lasting change into the industry. So now I really want to talk about B Corporation. And, you know, the founding story is that there's these guys that started And One, which is a basketball shoe company, and they had this incredible culture. They would feature their customers and do videos, and people loved the company. And then they sold it, and then all the values got stripped. And so these 2 founders and one of their best friends from college decided they wanted to start B Corporation. And what they did next was really cool. they asked about 20 or 30 of us, founders of social enterprises, to go to the Anza-Brega desert and sit in a room together for a couple of years and walk around the desert and talk about, what does the business community need? And they landed on really the three most important things that hadn't been addressed. One was the legal underpinnings, the deep code that drives, how we form our companies. And the other one was a transparent, objective set of metrics that we could measure ourselves against, because we were really upset about greenwashing and people just putting a label on them but not being transparent and not having them be objective. And so what happened is they also knew, they were really smart, they didn't get up in front of a room and say, hey, we're B Corporation. When they launched, they had about 10 entrepreneurs get up and one by one say why they thought B Corporation was important for the sustainable business community. And those 10 entrepreneurs became 70, and their declaration of interdependence is very reminiscent of what's happened at North Star. So this document, we all signed it, and we got to work. And what did that mean? So this is 2007, and our goal was to create new corporate code. And that meant working with nonprofits. Every business was super involved, talking to politicians. It didn't happen by giving money to a nonprofit. It happened by companies making it more important almost than their work. I talked about this a lot more than I talked about paper when I was on stages. So what happened? So these are all sort of the idea, the energy behind it were the actual companies that committed to it. And before we actually go into the successes, very briefly, I have 3 minutes, so we'll do 30 seconds on the history here. When this country was founded, there was a lot of distrust of corporations. And in fact, the Boston Tea Party was basically a big protest against a multinational corporation. And at the time of the founding, there were only 6 corporations. And corporate charters were granted for specific purposes, and only states could grant them because nobody trusted the federal government to do this. So just to get that context, and what happened? Well, big companies took advantage of this state system and were able to use their power to play states off each other and get different states to give them more power. No time to go into details, but over the past couple hundred years, corporations became empowered to do what they do today. So what did B Corp do? We used the same strategy for the opposite goal. And there were 2 states that were the first movers, Vermont and Maryland. And they passed legislation for public benefit corporation. It's a landmark thing in the history of corporations. It's a new corporate code that requires companies to consider all stakeholders, not just shareholders. A lot of you are probably familiar with this. It also requires reporting. But each state has a little different permutation on it. So I'm going to go real fast through what happened. So 2011, California, and 4 more states. 2012, a few more states. 2013, Delaware. So most corporations are incorporated in Delaware because of their legal history. Delaware came in 2013. We could never have imagined that when in 2007. We thought it would take a lot longer. So it's pretty exciting. And then more, and more, and more, and more. And finally, Alabama and Georgia in 2021. So this was super exciting, and the point here is that it lays the foundation. The goal was never to just rest on this new corporate code. This is now a basis to build more legal support for the type of work we're doing, incentives based on this sort of thing, et cetera. And it sets the stage perfectly for North Star. So I have 1 minute. Kind of address that. So I just kind of want to land on this, and actually I kind of want to be quiet and let everybody read it together, and then I'll say 1 or 2 last words. This is the ultimate integration challenge, right? This room is all about these experiences we have, but it's really all about what do you do with the experience. Let's do this.
Thank you so much, Jeff. So to tie all of these components together, next up we have Nicole Howell, and she will be discussing shaping the future of the regulatory policy landscape in our field.
Good morning, everyone. I am a human being who practices law as a profession and have used psychedelic substances and other consciousness expanding technologies in my path to figure out more of who and what I am. My work in the legal field has been with the cannabis and hemp industries for the past 7 years, along with my law partner who's been at it for about 15. And we participated in that change from the beginning when it wasn't legal through policy and regulatory changes, and have guided businesses as they've gone from illegal to now legal and regulated. And we've had some success there. It would be, and probably is today, would be sort of easy for us to pivot from that and take the opportunity to capitalize on the frenzy that really we see in this space. But we asked ourselves whether that really felt like the right thing to do. And we've made a conscious decision to really only work with businesses and individuals and companies that are on this path. We've really heard the call specifically of We Call It Paula and have seen that that's been our experience in cannabis and want to do what we can to prevent that from happening here. It also has led to the creation of the Psychedelic Bar Association, which my colleagues and I here are on the founding board of that organization. And we took the North Star Pledge and we customized it to be an invitation to attorneys to bring more of their humanity and their path into their practice of law in this space. Sort of like, okay, this is how the lawyers are going to show up. Now, if that all sounds like I'm tooting my own horn, it's not. Because for one, it's a tiny harmonica. And number two, it's because really it's a way of saying that we, just like you, we are here grappling with how to show up in this space professionally in a way that is authentic to what we deeply know to be true. And I know that's why you all are here too. So, my contribution to the panel this morning is really a quite simple one. If we think that, which button makes this go? Oh, the play button. If we think that ethical business practices are more than just a good idea, then we in this room, we should create standards like Jeff talks about. We should encourage one another. We should create community. And then we should turn our focus at the same time to the laws that are changing. And we in this room have the power to sit with lawmakers and legislators and say, this is how we want this industry to be regulated. We want to require ethical business practice. We want to require values-centered business models from the start, not later when we decide to regulate. Now, in every law that changes any substance from criminally sanctioned to any modicum other than that. Because if we don't do it now, as Liana said so well this morning, this is the foundation that we're laying. I can tell you from my experience in the cannabis legalization movement that the conversations that start at the beginning are the ones that really lay the groundwork for the conversations later. So, let me see, I think we'd switch slides. So, I want to give a couple examples of actual language that could be used in these laws. So there are kind of two types that Hadas talked about. We have a law that would say that these substances are now legal and we're going to regulate. So this is like Measure 109 in Oregon. And in those bills, our language might look something like this. A permitted organization means an entity or an association of entities that meets the standards either set by the agency to be a positive impact organization, after the agency or authorized third party evaluates the organization's legal structure and business operations for environmental sustainability, social responsibility, including social equity and indigenous reciprocity, and good governance. Now, this is just some language that we have been drafting together. Josh Capel and I worked on this recently, and this is open source. We can work on this together. But this is an example of a way that this can actually be codified into law, and this can be done. In a decriminalization measure, like Hadas spoke about, where we're not actually deciding to legalize, we're just saying that your personal use possession is no longer a crime, I would say it's equally, if not more important, to have language in these bills as well, because once you eliminate that measure of risk, you open up the opportunity for very risk-tolerant first movers to say, well, business isn't exactly legal right now, but possession is. There's a market. I'm going to fill that market. I'm going to take the risk. I'm going to start a business in this gray area. And if we don't not only signal, but if we don't say, yeah, but when that happens down the road, this is how these businesses will have to operate, this is how they have to look, it's the same thing as saying we want it to look like everything else ever has. So this decriminalization language, and I cribbed this straight from a bill that was just passed in California, AB 45, with regard to hemp products. And this says, because you do run into the problem with legislators and lawmakers, where they say, but if we're not regulating right now, we can't require things of future legislatures. It's a legal, it's a check and balance, right? You can't tell a future legislature what they're going to do. Well, in fact, this enacted law in California provides a mechanism for stating a very clear intention and requirements. So this one says that the agency shall prepare a report outlining the steps necessary for licensing and operation. The report shall include requirements governing the entities that apply and their qualifications and standards as permitted organizations. We insert our permitted organization language. And then finally, it is the intent of the legislature to consider, in light of the report, whether and how to take legislative action. It sets the tone from the beginning. The way that this is done in legislatures is, I don't know if I have any Trailer Park Boys fans out there, but it's not rocket appliances, okay? We get a coalition together, we hire a lobbyist, we get a bill sponsor, or we talk with the current sponsors, and we go to work. It's how the sausage is made in legislation. It isn't complicated. It's not to say that it's easy, but it isn't complicated. And we can do it, and we should, and we must, if we really mean what we say here today. So, who is that third party? Well, it could be a version of a benefit corporation. In general, we take the North Star ethics and we create a positive impact scorecard with categories and factors. Maybe we call it a P Corp. I don't know. We'll figure it out. North Star ethics, categories. Again, example language, open source. We talk about governance. We talk about steward ownership. We start shifting the conversation from who owns and dominates the shares of this business and who gets to benefit from them, and instead, who are we stewarding this intellectual property and this profit for? And we come up with metrics for how to analyze that. And we tell businesses and we give them the tools, here's what you key to. It's standard setting. It's raising the bar. It's why we're all here. So let's do it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. So before we move into questions, I just thought I'd give people a chance to think of their questions. Please just step right up into the center here. We have a microphone set up. And I would just like to share that I've been part of an effort at the MAPS organization and the MAPS Public Benefit Corporation, which is wholly owned by MAPS. I co-lead a cross-organizational impact team. And we've been working on since January, and now we have the near final draft of our own version of our own metric system and scorecard. Right now, there's about 120 different metrics that we're to be utilizing to judge and analyze MAPS's public benefit impact. And so the goal with setting this example with MAPS is to then open source this kind of scorecard, just like Nicole was describing, and turn it over to the rest of the industry and to see the ways that it can be continually improved upon or taken and reshaped and reformed and utilized as an invitation by other organizations in the field and companies in the field. So I just wanted to share that little information with you all, and just to say that we are all hard at work on many different things over here, and I really think what it's going to take is the business community coming together. In cannabis, they have the National Cannabis Industry Association, and I have gone and lobbied Congress on behalf of that organization in my prior life before I joined MAPS. I worked in cannabis as well. And I will tell you that businesses have a very powerful voice in shaping regulations. So something for us to keep in mind. And I think we have a few questions in the back. If you'd like to start us off, go ahead. And maybe you can share your name.
Thanks. It's Rebecca Lee. I'm from Journey Co-op. I wanted to thank all of you for this. It's a really helpful presentation. And as someone is at a stakeholder model company, I'm really proud to see more people advocating for it. So the question I have is with SB 519, which I'm very excited about. Hadas and Nicole, do you know, or Izzy, what is the state of conversations with DOJ? Right, so I know with cannabis, right, we got signal from the Obama administration that they were going to kind of let California do its thing, and that's how we're able to operate in this legal gray area. Do we know, is there any public signal from the Biden administration that they are going to take a similar stance?
Hi, Rebecca. It's good to see you. Thanks for that question. The short answer is no. With respect to psychedelics, I have heard rumblings of conversations about moving forward various forms of federal policy, but I think there is a coalition of folks from a number of different states that are all looking at that specific question that you talked about, which is, let's say we have 109 moving forward in Oregon. The report will be out this spring around like what the actual panel, the recommendations the panel comes with. By the end of next year, it's possible that we have 1, 2, 3 other states that have moved forward in some way, whether that's California or others. So while I haven't heard anything specific from the federal government about California specifically that I know of, I do know that there is a multi-state kind of advocacy push to seek something like a Cole memo approach from the Biden administration to say, okay, let the states go forward with their laboratory approaches. It's going to be a wide spectrum. We're already kind of seeing Texas and Pennsylvania on one side. You'll see like Hawaii and California and others be a little bit more out there. So I do think that it's possible, and I don't think it's super unreasonable to think that something like a Cole memo, federal government staying out of the state's business approach is possible. But the big difference there is that I think because there's such a wide spectrum of the types of approaches from 109 even to 519, where it's like, is this full decrim? Is this a regulated system? I do wonder what standards the federal government is going to expect to see from the states, and if there will be, if straight decrim will be okay, or if they're going to want more protections and more regulations. That's why I think one of the things about 519 is that there is a commission like the one that Nicole was talking about to look at regulation, but it's over a 2-year period. So I have a question really myself around how quickly the federal government is going to expect some sort of regulatory control from the states as they start to move forward themselves.
Okay, good morning, friends. My friends on the panel, I'm Sean McAllister, a lawyer in Colorado and California. I'm going to put you guys on the spot, you guys and ladies on the spot here, because 10 days ago we submitted language in Colorado for a 2022 ballot initiative to either decriminalize all psychedelics or psilocybin and have some regulatory model. And none of these initiatives have done a good job of addressing social equity. Oregon didn't do it at all and is trying to do it in the regulatory process. We actually put some ideas in this initiative, things like sliding scale for low-income people, like mandatory training of BIPOC facilitators. So putting you on the spot, what are your favorite ideas for social equity and decriminalization or legalization? You know, or maybe we just need a process to develop that, some would argue. So.
Yeah, well, I talked really about my favorite idea when I was up at the podium, but to flesh it out a little bit, I think we can build in that scorecard those various categories and metrics. We can create whatever we want in there, right? Jeff and I yesterday were talking about, maybe it's some metric in there. And it isn't the whole enchilada, but some metric in there that measures how much a business is improving year over year. Recognizing that, we are on this is a healing path for business. Like businesses are not starting out from the gold standard. When I talked about the decision we made not to sort of go and grab toward that frenzy, it means that we have less than on one hand, the number of clients that we're working with in that space. So we need to encourage one another to recognize the greed and the scarcity mindset that we all have. It's not that there are the bad, greedy, shady people and we're the good people, although I love that illustration. It's that we all have that in here. And so looking at that and making hard decisions that encourage us to improve and to heal. And I know, Sean, you're probably thinking, she's not answering my question at all. But the point that I'm really trying to make is that let's, as a community, come up with what those various factors are and create ways of really meaningfully measure them. And so I'll hand it over to anybody else who wants to.
I also want to add something that we were speaking about the other day, which is that part of all of our work is thinking about, yes, how to implement actual equity reinforcing provisions and structures. But I think that another piece here is critically re-examining our idea of ownership and why it's valuable. Ownership can be really valuable in terms of sustaining oneself and one's community, but I think that there's also something important here to me about not seeing the hierarchy, the pyramid in that way where the most important people are the ones at the top owning everything, and really finding value in the whole and in the collective and seeing things as a circle and seeing ownership not necessarily as like this prized thing to go after. It's a responsibility, and on some level I think should be treated as an honorable burden. Because it's not, ideally, I think if we're all doing our jobs correctly, it's not just going to be this cash cow. I think it's going to be a lot of work. And I know that doesn't really answer the equity question, but I think what I'm trying to say is that I don't think it's the most important thing. I think it's important that it's done well, but I don't think that it needs to be like the crown jewel of what we're aiming for.
I agree with everything that was said. But to get a little bit more specific on the question around policies and approaches, and I think this is something that both of you are also familiar with, one of the things I learned from the social equity movement within cannabis, which is different because with cannabis you have a large number of clearly identifiable people who've been impacted by cannabis prohibition. it's a little bit harder or more attenuated to identify the people who have been impacted by psychedelics prohibition. There are people who've been arrested and who have criminal records as a result, but it's a much smaller number. I believe that the impact of psychedelics prohibition started before the war on drugs. It started before the current prohibition framework. It started with the genocide of culture 400 years ago. So it's much harder to like clearly, okay, what's the line between that particular impact and what people deserve now to put us into a social equity frame. One thing that I think social equity in cannabis did really well is that it started primarily with this question of ownership. This is a business approach. Social equity means you can get priority access to licenses. I think that's a really important first step. But over the years, that started to evolve and expand to something that looks more like community reinvestment, where you have the benefits of cannabis businesses not just staying within the cannabis industry. And I think similarly, social equity within psychedelics can't just be lower prices for psychedelics for people. Like, it can't just be that. That cannot be the end of our imagination. So I think a lot about like what is the larger play outside of psychedelics and even maybe outside of healing and medicine that becomes available when some of these ethical business practices are followed, when some of this money is able to flow in other directions. So for example, it's not too cynical to say that a lot of multi-state operators within cannabis, they're working with cannabis as a product, but they're really working with real estate. They're really working with other large industries that also happen to, that they can sell cannabis at. And you see this kind of shift from cannabis being the primary thing to these other industries being what's primarily getting attracted and engaged with by these large multi-state operators where cannabis just happens to be the product. In that same way, if we're going to see an industry where, for example, you have plays that are really about real estate or really about these other industries, people that are going for therapy clinics, they're going for land, going for these different projects, it makes me wonder, what is the more expansive way to think about where that money, land, and resources can go? And to me, that's outside of just people who are using psychedelics. Indigenous reciprocity is not just giving a percent back to an indigenous tribe. Indigenous reciprocity means giving land back. And what that means is that as we develop access to these resources, whether it's money, whether it's land, we can't just look at people within our bubble that are using psychedelics to get those benefits. So I think social equity within psychedelics, because it doesn't have a huge number of people like cannabis impacted by that prohibition, where that money needs to be going to, those funds, that access needs to be going to, we can kind of think a little bit bigger and more specifically about what are the other ways that the benefits, the resources, and so on can actually go to people who deserve it, people who've been impacted by the war on drugs in a variety of ways, indigenous people, tribes, those people who may or may not like actually want or be seeking or know necessarily, or actually safely be able to access psychedelics in the short run, but who do need a lot of things like education and housing and food and these other critical things. Like, we could do more than just give people cheaper psychedelics. Yeah.
Thank you all so much. Izzy, that last point is so critically important. We have to look at, when we think about the larger mental health issue, and you said this earlier, having better interventions won't solve the problem. I think Kat might have said that earlier. We have to look at food security, job security, access to purpose. All of these are main contributors to health outcomes and mental health outcomes in our society. And so that invitation to think beyond just our immediate bubble here and to be intersectional in our approaches and in the work that we're doing in the world, and to understand that we are, there's so much power in that, right? In bringing together and circling around healing, and then asking ourselves, how can we reach out beyond that? And then just the other thing I'd like to share in closing, is there another question? Okay, great. Go for it.
You can continue. It's great to see you up there, Liana.
Nice to see you too.
Well, hi everyone. My name is Echo. Hi. Good to see you too. I'm a social entrepreneur, and social equity is very important to me, so thank you so much for asking that question. And my North Stars are, how do we share power, how do we build power in communities that have hitherto been really marginalized? And also my day job, I have a social impact consulting firm, but my real passion is psychedelics entrepreneurship. So to that end, I currently have a psilocybin edibles concept, which is in gray market, obviously. And so I have two questions. One question is, Have you thought of, or does a toolkit for social entrepreneurs exist in this market? And if not, are you interested in collaborating on such a document so that we can kind of like take it and run as we wait for regulations to catch up? Like, for example, is there a professional liability insurance for entrepreneurs who are interested in being first movers and taking risks, but also have real responsibilities and need to take care of financial realities, for example, for our families?
All right, I think I'll give a little effort at that answer. There are some toolkits, and you can go to the B Corp is a good place to start. And their assessment is free. And one of the cool things they did when they designed the assessment is it's available for anybody, which is good. And then when you do it, where you don't score so well, they have tips and tools and resources. So it actually is incredibly simple and easy way to get a quick gut check and a reality check on where you are doing some good things. And then if it's not scores well, there's a button to click and you can learn more about what you can do differently. I'm also super excited about what's happening with North Star to sort of build the more customized version of that for this industry. And the B Corp survey, by the way, used to be this, like, I don't know, 60 questions generic thing. It's been evolving a lot over the past 15 years. And now there's, I don't know, 20 different categories. But I don't think they're going to do this one for us. I think we need to do this one for ourselves.
Yeah, and I'll just add that we would love for there to be a toolkit, and I think there's been starts and stops at different projects along the way. And really, this whole kind of day is about opening up to our community here and creating that invitation for more collaboration, more bringing together of all of our individual and unique knowledges and skill sets and seeing what we can build together. So thank you for that. Is there any more questions?
We have 2 more questions.
Okay, I think we have time. Do we have time? We have time for one more, unfortunately. Go for it.
Hi. My name's Brahm. I'm an investor in the space. When you talk about like these scorecards that have 120 questions and actually integrating these into the laws, is there any concern that this sort of creates almost like a regulatory capture situation where only the larger organizations that can afford staff to like make sure they're complying and report on like their compliance of these regulations are able to participate in the industry, and that these sorts of things can actually be like exclusionary for smaller players?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's not one you just solve or say you check that box. It is true that the larger companies have this whole ESG department with 20 people, and they can sometimes compete on how they tell stories. That said, I do think it is possible to have. I mean, the B. I'm not in work for B Corp. I think B Corp's great. I think we're going to add on and make it better, but their assessment is not an expensive thing to do. It takes time, and it's transparent, which is great. And I don't know how to answer that more than that, but I think that we can create a tool that is affordable and accessible to small companies and actually favor them to a certain degree, because a small, focused, mission-driven company has a lot more comfort being transparent and doing some of the things that are required on this survey as opposed to the larger ones.
Yeah, and I'll just add that is definitely a concern, and especially when you start talking about adding legislation in the regulatory framework, right? We don't want to make it impossible for people to run and operate businesses. And so finding and striking that balance is going to be our challenge and opportunity. Early on, when California first passed Proposition 215 to create a framework for medicalized cannabis, they required that all businesses operated as nonprofits, right? And so there is precedent for things like this. I think there is appetite and space for more formats and structures beyond just the nonprofit structure, especially as our next panel is going to go in all the exciting ways that you can design your business. But I think that, do you have something? Okay, yeah. The thing I really wanted to land on is that this is an iterative process. This is a process that's going to require us to experiment, which is great because we're an experimental bunch. It's going to require us to work together and to lean on collaboration and collectivism, in some cases over competition, right, as a primary organizing principle. And so this is the process that we're in, and really inviting all of you in with us to join us on it.
Just to that last point, I was going to say that it's sort of a testimony for why requiring it in law is really important, because then being interested in public benefit, in positive impact, doesn't put you at a competitive disadvantage. It's the standard, and as Jeff points out, it's not an expensive thing to assess those elements and to put them into your business. It's to think about those. You don't think about the things that go to the costs of your business that go to increasing scale or increasing profit. Those are never brought out as like, oh, this is making the bar to entry so much higher. It's a shift in thinking about the value that we're creating and the cost of creating that kind of value, to think about that more holistically than just short-term profiteering.
Amazing. Thank you so much to all of our panelists.